I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how a single day destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and myself. When I returned from my mother's funeral in Portland, Maine on that cold November afternoon, my hands still smelled like lilies and my eyes felt hollow from crying. The limousine ride from Pine Grove Cemetery felt endless, and all I wanted was to curl up in bed and pretend the last week hadn't happened. My mother, Margaret Mitchell, had been the strongest woman I'd ever known. She raised me alone in that beautiful Victorian house on Spring Street after my father left when I was 3 years old. She worked as a hospital administrator at Maine Medical Center, built a life from nothing, and never once made me feel the absence of my father. Now she was gone. The cancer took her faster than anyone expected, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. I remember the last conversation we had in her hospital room. She held my hand with surprising strength and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. I leaned in closer, but the machines kept beeping and the nurses kept interrupting, and by the time I thought to ask her to repeat it, she was already fading into the morphine sleep. Now I would never know what she wanted to tell me. My husband, David, had been supportive through the funeral planning, though I noticed he spent an awful lot of time asking about the financial details of her estate. David worked in pharmaceutical sales for Merck, making good money, but he had this habit of always wanting to know how much things were worth. I'd attributed it to his analytical mind, his need to organize and understand the world through numbers. I had no idea it was something much darker. When we arrived back at our home in Cape Elizabeth, a modest 4-bedroom colonial we'd bought 8 years ago with a substantial mortgage, David suggested I take the evening to myself. He said he had some work calls to catch up on and would order pizza for dinner. I was grateful for the space. I changed out of my black funeral dress and into yoga pants and one of David's old MIT sweatshirts. Yes, he went to MIT, which was part of his charm when we met at a Boston networking event. He was brilliant, driven, and seemed to worship me in those early days. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and decided to finally go through my mother's desk, which the estate lawyer had asked me to inventory before our meeting on Thursday. The mahogany desk had been in my mother's study since I was a child. I remember doing homework at its corner while she worked late into the nights, and I remembered the smell of her lavender lotion mixed with old paper and ink. The lawyer had given me a key to her office, and I'd brought back several boxes of documents. But before I opened those boxes, something made me check the desk itself. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was the fact that my mother always kept important things hidden in that one particular drawer, the shallow one under the main desktop behind a false panel. I reached up and felt for the small brass knob I knew was there. My fingers found it. The drawer slid open silently, and inside, arranged with the precision my mother was famous for, were 3 leather envelopes, a flash drive labeled "Sarah, read this first," and a sealed letter in my mother's distinctive handwriting. My heart began to race in a way that had nothing to do with grief. I knew my mother well enough to understand that nothing hidden in that drawer was casual or forgotten. This was deliberate. This was planned. I sat down at her desk, pulled out the first envelope, and opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a legal document from a Portland law firm, Hartwell and Associates. The letterhead read, "Last Will and Testament of Margaret Mitchell." But this wasn't the will the lawyer had showed me. This was something else entirely. As I read through the pages, my vision began to blur. The document detailed assets that made no sense. A property deed for 247 acres of farmland in Harpswell, Maine, appraised at $2.3 million. A deed to a mansion in Westbrook that I'd never heard of, valued at $4.7 million. Stock portfolios totaling $8.9 million. Bank accounts in 3 different institutions with a combined balance of $6.2 million. Real estate investment trusts worth another $3.4 million. And all of it, every single dollar, every piece of property, every investment, was left entirely to me. Not to my uncle in New Hampshire. Not to charity. To me. My mother, the woman I thought worked as a hospital administrator her entire life, had somehow amassed a personal fortune of approximately $25 million. And she had never told me. Not once. Not in any conversation, not in any hint or suggestion, not even when we talked about my student loan debt or my worries about our mortgage payment. I sat in that desk chair for what felt like hours, unable to breathe properly. My hands kept rereading the same numbers, convinced I was misunderstanding them. But the document was clear, witnessed, notarized, and dated just 8 months ago, shortly after she'd received her cancer diagnosis. She had known she was dying, and she had made preparations. In that moment, something else occurred to me with creeping dread. If David had overheard conversations about my mother's health, if he'd been present at family dinners where estate matters might have been discussed, what did he already know? And more importantly, what had he been planning? I heard David's voice before I saw him. He was in the kitchen and he was on the phone. The door to my mother's study was ajar, and I could hear him clearly through the open space. At first, I didn't move. I was still sitting at the desk, the inheritance documents spread across the mahogany surface like evidence at a crime scene, and David was talking to someone. I couldn't tell who, in a tone I'd never heard before. It was smooth, calculated, and completely devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for me. "She's been at that funeral all day," he was saying. "Probably crying, feeling vulnerable, exactly the way we need her." My blood froze. We? Who was we? And what did it matter what emotional state I was in? I moved silently to the doorway, keeping myself hidden behind the partially closed door. Through the crack, I could see David in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesticulating animatedly, even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. It was a habit he'd never bothered to break, and usually it was endearing. Now it felt sinister. "The lawyer mentioned it briefly at the funeral reception," David continued. "Something about substantial assets. I've been playing the grieving son-in-law perfectly, helped with the arrangements, stayed by her side, played the supportive husband. She won't suspect a thing." I felt physically ill. The room began to spin slightly, and I had to grip the doorframe to keep myself upright. "Once she's settled into grief mode, I'll suggest we meet with a financial advisor. Someone I know personally. We'll frame it as protecting her future and managing the inheritance responsibly. By the time she figures out what's happened, we'll have already moved half of it into untraceable accounts." Untraceable accounts. He was talking about stealing from me. Not immediately, not obviously, but systematically, professionally, with the kind of planning that suggested this wasn't a spontaneous idea. This had been years in the making. "No, she'll never suspect me," David said, laughing actually. Laughing, in a way that made my skin crawl. "Sarah's too trusting. Too emotional. She makes decisions based on feelings rather than logic. That MIT background of mine? She thinks it means I'm smart. She has no idea it means I know exactly how to manipulate financial systems without leaving a digital trail. I learned from the best. My father's been running schemes like this for decades." My father-in-law. Of course. David's father, whom I'd never met and who lived in Connecticut and whom David spoke about rarely, always with an odd mixture of respect and bitterness. Suddenly, a lot of his reluctance to visit made sense. It wasn't family dysfunction. It was criminal conspiracy, and he was trying to keep me away from it. Or rather, he had been. Now he was making me part of it, whether I liked it or not. "The farmland is perfect," David continued. "I can liquidate that quietly through a real estate company I've already set up under a shell corporation. The mansion will take longer, but we'll say we're doing renovations and use that as an excuse to take out equity loans against it. The investment accounts are the easiest. I'll move money into spousal accounts slowly enough that she won't notice the individual transactions. Americans don't check their statements carefully enough. Sarah definitely won't." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run into that kitchen and confront him right then, demand explanations, ask him who he was and what he'd done with the man I married. But something deeper, some instinct, some survival mechanism, kept me rooted to the spot. If David was this calculating, this prepared, then confronting him without a plan of my own would be exactly what he expected me to do. And he would have answers ready. Smooth, plausible explanations that would make me doubt my own ears. "I have to go," David said suddenly. "She'll be wondering where I am. I'll call you after I talk to the financial advisor." We'll expedite the timeline. Once we consolidate the assets, we'll have enough to retire comfortably, maybe start that real estate development company in Florida. With her money, we can be untouchable. He hung up. I heard him set his phone down on the granite countertop. I heard him open the refrigerator and pull out a bottle of beer. I heard him sit down at the kitchen table, the very table where we'd shared breakfast this morning, where he'd held my hand while I cried about losing my mother, where he told me that everything would be okay and that he'd be there for me no matter what. All of it had been a performance. A masterpiece of deception orchestrated by a man I'd slept next to for 12 years, given my name to, introduced to my dying mother, trusted with my entire future. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. I became aware, gradually, that I was shaking, not from cold, but from rage so pure and so comprehensive that I could barely see straight. My hands kept clenching and unclenching. My breath came in short gasps. And through it all, I kept thinking the same thought over and over. I had to be smarter than him. I had to think like he did. I had to turn his own analytical mind against him, using the very skills he'd bragged about to destroy whatever scheme he'd constructed. I needed help. And I needed it immediately. At 10:47 p.m. that night, I sent an email to Margaret Chin Mitchell's estate lawyer, Thomas Hartwell, with a subject line urgent, security concern with inheritance. I kept the message brief and professional, asking for an emergency meeting first thing in the morning and mentioning only that I had discovered additional documents and needed legal advice regarding asset protection. I didn't mention David. Not yet. That would come later, once I had all my pieces in place. I then created a new email account using a Gmail address that wasn't connected to my normal accounts, sarum.legal47@gmail.com, and used it to send messages to 3 different financial forensic accountants in the Portland area. I found them through a combination of Google searches and Bar Association referrals, and I explained that I needed someone who specialized in uncovering fraudulent financial transfers and hidden asset movements. I offered to pay premium rates for discretion and speed. All 3 responded within an hour, which told me they understood the urgency. I also called my friend Jennifer Chin, no relation to my mother despite the shared last name, who worked as a prosecutor in the Maine Attorney General's office. I didn't use my home phone. Instead, I went to the back patio, borrowed the Wi-Fi from our neighbor 2 houses down, thankfully they had it unsecured, and called her using the Telegram app, which I'd quickly downloaded to my phone. Sarah? Jennifer's voice was confused. It's almost 11 at night. Is everything okay? No, I said quietly. I need your advice on something. It's about David, and I need you to listen carefully, because I can only explain this once tonight. I laid it all out for her. The phone conversation, the inheritance documents, the mention of shell corporations and spousal accounts, and the involvement of his father. Jennifer, who had spent 15 years prosecuting white-collar crime, went very quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted into the measured, careful tone she probably used in courtrooms. Okay, she said. First, I need to know. Do you have proof of this conversation? Just my testimony, I said. I heard it, but I didn't record it. That's not ideal, Jennifer said, but it's not nothing. Sarah, what you're describing is conspiracy to commit financial fraud and potentially money laundering. This is serious federal crime territory. But we need to build a case carefully. If David suspects you know anything, he'll move faster. He'll liquidate assets, transfer money, and you'll lose everything. So what do? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. What do I do right now? You act normal, Jennifer said. You don't confront him. You don't ask questions that would alert him. What you do is gather evidence, email chains, bank statements, financial records. You document everything. And you call me tomorrow after you've talked to Hartwell. We may need to contact the FBI or the SEC, depending on how extensive this scheme is. I spent the rest of that night in the guest bedroom, telling David I was emotionally exhausted and needed to sleep alone, going through the documents my mother had left me with fresh eyes. Now that I knew what I was looking for, I began to see patterns. The oldest document in the leather envelopes was dated 15 years ago. It was a letter from my mother, addressed to me but clearly meant to be read after her death. She explained that she had discovered, quite by accident, that my father, whom I'd always believed had simply abandoned us and cut off contact, had actually left her a substantial sum of money in his will when he died. He'd passed away in a car accident in Boston when I was 7 years old, and his family, my paternal grandmother and uncle, had apparently tried to hide the inheritance from my mother because they considered her an unsuitable mother who couldn't be trusted with money. But my mother was nothing if not resourceful. She'd hired an investigator, located the money, and spent years in court fighting for what was legally hers. She'd won. And then, rather than spending it immediately or telling anyone, she'd invested it, carefully, methodically, with the help of a financial advisor she trusted implicitly. She'd tripled it over the years. The mansion had been purchased 15 years ago for a price that should have been impossible on a hospital administrator's salary, but suddenly made sense when you factored in the inheritance she'd received. The farmland had been purchased at auction 10 years ago when the local agricultural market crashed, and she'd watched it appreciate steadily. The investment accounts had been opened and funded with disciplined, strategic contributions. And all of it, she'd kept secret from me. In her letter, she explained why. "My darling Sarah," she wrote in her distinctive handwriting, "if I tell you about this money, you will feel obligated to help support me, or to feel guilty that I sacrificed for you. You will also carry the burden of keeping a secret from anyone you love. I have chosen to carry that burden alone so that you can live freely, make your own choices, and never feel indebted to me for anything. But now, as I face the end of my time with you, I want you to have the security that I never had. Not because I want you to be rich, the money means nothing, but because I want you to be free. And freedom requires options. The investments are detailed in the second envelope. The house of my life advice is in the third. Please read the second envelope first, then read the letter to your financial advisor, then, only then, read my final letter to you." I pulled out the second envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a comprehensive financial summary, account numbers, passwords stored in an encrypted format. She left the decryption key written out in old-fashioned code on a separate page, property deeds, investment details, everything a person could possibly need to access and manage a $25 million fortune. And there was another letter, this one addressed to Thomas Hartwell. My mother had documented everything meticulously, including her suspicions about David. "I have observed," she'd written to her lawyer, "that my son-in-law takes unusual interest in financial matters, asks probing questions about my assets, and exhibits behavior patterns consistent with someone planning fraud. I cannot be certain of this, but I am certain that I do not want my daughter left vulnerable. Therefore, I am establishing a separate trust, administered independently, with my assets in multiple accounts that are designed to prevent fraudulent transfers. My daughter will have full access to the principal and income, but only in such a way that she cannot be pressured or deceived into signing away her rights." My mother had not only anticipated my husband's schemes. She had built a legal fortress to stop them. The next morning, I sat across from Thomas Hartwell in his office on Congress Street in Portland. He was a man in his 70s, with a kind of measured calm that comes from decades of handling people's financial crises. When I showed him the documents I'd found and explained what I'd overheard, his expression didn't change, but his fingers drummed once on the desktop, a tiny tell that betrayed his concern. "Your mother was extraordinarily prescient," he said finally. "And I'm glad she was, because what you're describing is exactly the scenario she wanted to protect you from." He pulled out a thick file from his cabinet, a file that had apparently been prepared specifically for this moment, with my mother's handwriting on dozens of tabs. "She came to see me 6 months ago," Thomas explained. "She was already ill, though she tried not to show it. She told me that she was concerned about her son-in-law's character, that she'd noticed certain behaviors that troubled her. Specifically, she mentioned that he'd asked her detailed questions about her investment strategy, her net worth, her insurance policies, and her will. She said he'd done so in a casual, friendly way, always framing it as interest in her financial security, but that the pattern and the intensity felt calculated to her." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because it wasn't my place," Thomas said. "And because at that point, She had no concrete proof. She was concerned about a man based on intuition and behavioral analysis. The courts would have laughed at that. But it was enough to make her act. He walked me through my mother's precautions. She had established a revocable living trust, but the terms were constructed in such a way that I could not be pressured into transferring assets to a spouse, because all major transfers required my signature and verification from the trust administrator, a trust company that she'd appointed, not me, to oversee the accounts. She had placed certain assets into a separate limited liability corporation with language that prevented any transfer of ownership without specific court order and spousal consent documentation. And she had established a separate account designated as personal gifts, $2 million in readily accessible funds. That was mine outright, with no limitations. This $2 million is your buffer, Thomas explained. She wanted you to have enough money to get out of your marriage if it came to that. To leave, to hire lawyers, to protect yourself. She didn't want you to ever feel trapped because of finances. I began to cry, really cry, in a way that was different from my mother's death 2 days earlier. This was release of a different kind. This was the realization that my mother had loved me so completely that she'd looked into the future, seen danger, and built protections for me that would work even if I didn't know they were there. What do I do about David? I asked Thomas through my tears. What are my options? That depends on what you want the outcome to be, Thomas said carefully. Are you looking to divorce him, prosecute him, or something else? I want him exposed, I said, surprising myself with the violence in my voice. I want everyone to know who he really is. I want him to face consequences for what he's done and what he was planning to do. But I also want to make sure he can never do this to anyone else. Thomas nodded slowly. Then here's what we need to do. The plan was intricate and required coordination with multiple parties. First, I needed to go back to the financial forensic accountants I'd contacted and have them begin a detailed analysis of David's financial patterns, his accounts, his investments, any shell corporations he'd established, any transfers he'd made that might constitute fraud. Second, I needed to contact the FBI's white-collar crime division and file a formal complaint about the conspiracy I'd overheard, now that I had legal representation and could document the inherent circumstances that David was apparently attempting to exploit. Third, I needed to gather evidence of David's communications, his phone records, his emails, any written evidence of the scheme. And fourth, I needed to stay in the house, act normal, and let him believe that he still had the opportunity to execute his plan. That's going to be difficult, Thomas warned. Living with someone while you're building a case against them. Knowing what he's planning. It will be emotionally taxing. I can do it, I said. I need to do it. My mother did the hard thing. I can too. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, I had a forensic accountant named Dr. Marcus Williams, who worked for a Boston firm specializing in fraud cases, conducting a preliminary analysis of David's digital footprint. By 4 p.m., I had submitted my formal complaint to the FBI's Boston field office with Jennifer's help. And by 6 p.m., I was home, helping David plan dinner, acting as though my world hadn't just been fundamentally altered. For 3 weeks, I played a role. I was the grieving daughter, still emotional about my mother's death. I was the devoted wife, supporting David as he helped me navigate my inheritance. I let him suggest meetings with financial advisors, all of whom he knew personally and who, I later learned through my forensic accountant, were complicit in his scheme. I watched as he carefully, methodically began the process of gaining access to my accounts. I documented everything. The forensic accountant found records of 5 different shell corporations that David had established over the past 8 years. I found emails between David and his father discussing their long-term play to extract the maximum possible liquidity from me before divorcing me and moving the funds overseas. I discovered bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfer protocols, and strategies for making the fraud look like legitimate business expenses and investment decisions. But I also found something else. Evidence that David and his father had done this before. There was a case file, printed and hidden in David's home office, relating to a woman named Christine in Denver, who had divorced David's father in 1987 after he'd stolen approximately $4 million from her family trust. The case had been settled quietly, with a non-disclosure agreement that prevented Christine from speaking about it publicly. There was another file for a woman named Patricia in Boston, David's first wife, whom I'd known about but had been told had left him because of personal incompatibility. She had apparently lost $800,000 to his schemes before discovering the fraud. The pattern was clear. This was a family business. And David had learned from the master. On the evening of November 19th, exactly 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, I received a phone call from Dr. Williams at the forensic accounting firm. He'd completed his preliminary investigation and had findings that constituted comprehensive evidence of fraud and money laundering. I told him I needed to document one more thing. That night, after David came home from work, I told him I wanted to have a serious conversation about the inheritance. I said I was feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility and wanted his advice on how to proceed. He was delighted. We sat down in the living room with glasses of wine, and I started the conversation that I'd been rehearsing for 3 weeks. "I've been thinking about something you said a few weeks ago," I began carefully. "You mentioned that some of my mother's assets might be in accounts that aren't easily accessible. Can you explain what you meant by that?" David's expression shifted slightly, just a microsecond of calculation before his charming mask reasserted itself. "That's right," he said smoothly. "Some investment accounts have transfer restrictions. I've been looking into how we might consolidate everything into a more liquid structure. For tax purposes, obviously." "For tax purposes," I repeated. "Not for any other reason?" "Of course not," David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he thought I wasn't being logical. "Sarah, I'm trying to help you. These accounts are complicated. If we don't consolidate them properly, you could lose a significant percentage to taxes and inefficient management." "I see," I said. And then I played the ace I'd been holding. "I want to show you something." I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording I'd made. I'd figured out how to do it 3 weeks earlier, recording David's phone call using an app that cloned his call and sent it to a separate encrypted server. It was technically illegal in some states, but Maine was a single consent state, and I consented to recording my own environment. As David listened to his own voice, discussing untraceable accounts, shell corporations, liquidating my assets, I watched the color drain from his face. When the recording finished, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Dr. Williams's forensic report, the files about Christine and Patricia, documentation of the shell corporations, the Cayman accounts, everything. "What is this?" David whispered. "This is evidence," I said calmly. "This is a comprehensive record of your intent to commit fraud against me. And I want you to know that as of 2 hours ago, this entire file has been submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Maine Attorney General's office, and a personal injury attorney who specializes in fraud cases. I've also filed for divorce, and the papers will be served to you tomorrow morning." David stood up, so quickly his wine glass fell over and shattered on the floor. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous quality I'd never heard before. "You're making a mistake. A huge mistake." "My father will." "Will what?" I interrupted. "Threaten me? Commit fraud against me? He already has. And now he gets to face the consequences. And so do you." "You've ruined yourself," David said bitterly. "The legal fees alone will bankrupt you. I have lawyers. I have resources. I'm going to fight this, and I'm going to win, and you're going to end up with nothing." "No," I said, pulling out a document that Thomas Hartwell had prepared for exactly this moment. "I'm going to end up with everything my mother left me. The trust is secure. The assets are protected. You can't touch them. And the evidence against you is absolutely airtight." For a moment, I thought David might become physically violent. His fists clenched, and his face flushed with rage. But then something shifted in his expression, a calculation, a reassessment. He sat back down slowly and picked up the folder of evidence. As he flipped through it, his anger seemed to transform into something else. Desperation. Fear. The realization that he'd been outmaneuvered by a woman he dismissed as too emotional and not logical enough to ever catch him. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. or I will call the police and have you arrested. You have 1 hour to pack a bag and leave. Your attorney can arrange pickup of your other belongings next week." David left that night. He went to a hotel, and by the next morning, federal agents had arrived at our door with a warrant to search our home and David's office. They found the computers he'd tried to hide in the basement, the documentation of the offshore accounts, and dozens of files related to fraudulent schemes going back more than a decade. What followed over the next 6 months was an odyssey through the federal court system. David and his father were both indicted on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and financial fraud. The evidence was so comprehensive that both of them took plea deals rather than risk trial. David received a sentence of 7 years in federal prison. His father, who had orchestrated the original scheme with a woman in Denver more than 30 years earlier and had never been prosecuted, received 12 years. I learned, through the federal investigation, that David and his father had defrauded at least 7 women over the course of 3 decades, stealing a combined total of approximately $47 million. Most of those women had never even known they were being defrauded. They'd simply left their marriages feeling confused, emotionally damaged, and financially devastated, with no idea why their supposedly loving husbands had slowly bled them dry. Now, finally, someone knew the truth. And more importantly, those women would have the opportunity to recover their losses through asset seizure and restitution. But the most important revelation came about 3 months into the federal investigation, when a woman named Christine, the woman from Denver, the one whose case had been settled with a non-disclosure agreement, came forward. She asked to meet with me. We met at a coffee shop in Boston, and she brought her daughter with her. Christine was in her 70s now, and her daughter was in her 50s, and they had both lost their childhoods, their family fortune, and years of their lives to the fraud that David's father had committed against them. "I want to thank you," Christine said, tears streaming down her face. "I want to thank you for being brave enough to do what I wasn't, for not accepting the settlement and the silence, for going to the authorities even when it would have been easier to just walk away. I couldn't have done any of this without my mother," I told her honestly. "She left me a roadmap. She anticipated what was coming. She protected me from beyond the grave." Christine hugged me tightly, and in that moment, I finally understood the full weight of what my mother had given me. It wasn't just money. It wasn't just protection. It was the gift of seeing danger clearly, of acting on that vision, and of using that clarity to help others who had suffered in silence. Today, 6 months after David's conviction, I am sitting in the study of the farmhouse in Harpswell, one of my mother's properties, now my sanctuary. I have established a foundation in her name that works with the FBI and the Department of Justice to identify financial fraud victims and help them recover their assets and rebuild their lives. I have used a portion of my mother's inheritance to fund legal clinics in Maine and Massachusetts that provide pro bono representation to people who have been defrauded. And I have decided that I want to tell this story. Not for revenge, though there is some of that. But because there are women out there right now, sitting in living rooms with men they trust, listening to lies being told in voices that sound like love. And I want those women to know that they can recognize the danger, that they can build a plan, that they can protect themselves. What I'm about to tell you is the part that most people don't expect, and honestly, when I realized it myself, I questioned everything I thought I knew about how the world works. About 3 weeks after David's sentencing, I received a letter from his attorneys. It wasn't an appeal, at least not directly. It was a request for a meeting. I was hesitant, but my attorney, Margaret Rodriguez, a fierce advocate who'd handled the divorce proceedings, encouraged me to hear what they had to say. We met in the conference room of a law office in Portland, and what I learned there changed my entire understanding of David's motivations, and, in some ways, made everything both clearer and more complicated. David's defense attorneys explained that David wanted to confess to something beyond what had already been documented. He wanted to explain on the record how his father had manipulated him into the schemes. They wanted me to hear it, and they wanted it documented, because David believed that the full truth might somehow mitigate the harm he'd caused, though they acknowledged that nothing could truly do that. I agreed to listen to a recorded testimony. What David explained, in that recording, was a childhood shaped by coercion and psychological manipulation. His father had introduced him to financial fraud not as a choice, but as a family legacy, something he was expected to understand and participate in from adolescence onward. David had been tested in various ways, trusted with knowledge of accounts, asked to help move money, gradually introduced to the moral flexibility required to view other people's assets as fair game. By the time David reached adulthood, he had been so thoroughly conditioned to see fraud as normal, as simply how smart people operated in the world, that he couldn't imagine doing anything else. This didn't excuse what he'd done. It didn't make him a victim, and I don't want to present it that way. David had made choices, conscious choices, to continue the pattern into his adult life, and to target me specifically for fraud. But it did provide context. It helped me understand that what I'd been dealing with wasn't a person with an evil core, but a person who had been trained, since childhood, in criminal behavior. I shared this information with Christine, the woman from Denver, and with the other fraud victims who had come forward. Some of them found the explanation helpful, a way to contextualize the harm they'd experienced. Others found it infuriating. They didn't want to understand David or his father. They just wanted the harm to stop, and it had, and that was enough. I focused on what I could control, the work of the foundation, the legal clinics, and the healing that comes from taking action. And I focused on understanding my mother's wisdom in a deeper way. She had known, somehow, that David was capable of harm. Not because she could read minds, but because she had lived long enough to recognize patterns of behavior that signaled danger. Charming men who asked too many questions about money. Husbands who wanted to help with finances, but not with household tasks. Men who viewed relationships in terms of what could be extracted, rather than what could be built together. These were the patterns my mother had learned to see, and she had passed that knowledge on to me, not explicitly, but through her actions and her precautions. The farmhouse in Harpswell has become the headquarters of the Margaret Chin Mitchell Foundation for Financial Justice and Fraud Prevention. We work with law enforcement, with the legal community, and with survivors of financial fraud to identify patterns, build cases, and help people recover their financial lives. And we do something else. We train women and men, but primarily women, to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and fraud. Because the truth that came out through David's prosecution and the subsequent investigation is that this crime is far more prevalent than anyone realizes. The FBI estimates that romance scams and financial fraud within relationships costs Americans approximately $1.3 billion per year. But that's just the recorded cases. The actual number is likely much higher because many victims never come forward, never tell anyone, never seek help. They're too ashamed, too embarrassed, or too afraid of not being believed. I decided that I would tell my story publicly, and I chose to do it here, in this format, because I want to reach people in the moments when they're alone with their doubts. When they're wondering if they're being paranoid, or if there's something genuinely wrong with their relationship. When they're noticing red flags but dismissing them because they love someone. I want those people to know, trust your instincts, watch for patterns. And if you notice that someone in your life is taking unusual interest in your finances, in your assets, in your family's money, that's not necessarily a sign of guilt. But it's a sign that you should pay attention. It's a sign that you should document things. It's a sign that you should seek advice from people you trust, lawyers, accountants, therapists, friends. It's a sign that you should protect yourself, not because you're paranoid, but because you're wise. My mother lived 73 years on this earth. She had a career. She raised a daughter alone. She built a fortune through intelligence and discipline and careful decision-making. And in her final act, she left me not just money, but wisdom. She left me the knowledge that love and trust don't require blindness. That protecting yourself financially doesn't mean you don't love your partner. It means you're being responsible. That asking questions and seeking information isn't paranoia. It's prudence. And she left me the tools to recognize danger and to act on that recognition. I've used those tools to protect myself. And now I'm using them to help protect others. That is the legacy of Margaret Chin Mitchell. That is what her life meant and what her death made possible. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. It's been 18 months since David's conviction. The farmhouse now hosts monthly workshops where I teach people about financial literacy, fraud prevention, and recognizing the early warning signs of financial abuse. We've helped 43 individuals recover assets that they didn't even know had been taken from them. We've trained 217 women and 18 men to understand their own financial situations more clearly and to recognize the value of protecting themselves legally and financially. The Margaret Mitchell Foundation has also begun working with the pharmaceutical industry to implement better training on ethical behavior. It turns out that David wasn't just running fraud schemes on his wife. He was also involved in some questionable activities at Merck, things that technically weren't illegal but existed in that gray zone of corporate behavior that exploits regulatory loopholes. My expose of David's activities led to a broader investigation that resulted in the company implementing new compliance programs and, not incidentally, revising their sales practices in ways that the company claims has improved their ethical standing. I don't know if that's true. I'm skeptical of corporate claims about ethics. But I do know that the investigation happened, and that's something. More personally, I've learned to trust my instincts again after a period of doubt that followed David's revelation. I questioned everything about myself for several months. Was I too suspicious? Too paranoid? Had I overreacted? But talking with other fraud survivors helped me understand that these doubts were normal, that they were part of the emotional aftermath of discovering that someone you loved had been deceiving you. The self-doubt doesn't mean your instincts were wrong. It means you're processing trauma. And that's okay. I haven't dated anyone since the divorce was finalized. I'm not ruling it out, but I'm also not pursuing it aggressively. I'm working on knowing myself in a way that doesn't require external validation. I'm healing in ways that don't depend on another person to make me feel complete. And I'm learning that solitude, chosen solitude, is a luxury I never had before. The fortune my mother left me has become a tool for good, or at least I hope it is. I've given away more than 40% of it to the foundation, to legal clinics, to charities focused on financial justice. I'm still absurdly wealthy by any reasonable standard, and I use that wealth to work on problems that matter to me. To protect people who might otherwise be vulnerable. To give women the tools and knowledge to protect themselves. To make sure that what happened to Christine, to Patricia, to all the other women who were defrauded by David and his father, never happens to anyone else if I can help prevent it. So here's what I want to leave you with if you're hearing this story and you're wondering what it means for your own life. First, if you feel doubt about someone in your life, don't dismiss that doubt because you love them or because they love you or because you've already invested years in the relationship. Love and doubt can coexist. Healthy love actually requires a certain amount of healthy suspicion and boundary setting. Second, protect your finances. Know your own bank accounts. Check your credit reports. Understand where your money is and what it's doing. Don't delegate this responsibility to anyone else, even someone you love. Third, trust the women in your life who are trying to warn you. My mother was trying to warn me through her actions, and I was lucky enough to listen, even though I didn't understand her warnings at the time. Fourth, if you discover fraud, if you discover deception, if you discover that someone you love has been stealing from you or planning to steal from you, tell someone. Tell a lawyer. Tell a friend. Tell law enforcement. Don't stay silent because you're ashamed or because you're trying to protect the other person's reputation. Your silence protects them and endangers other potential victims. And finally, you're stronger than you think. You can survive betrayal. You can rebuild. You can take what was meant to harm you and transform it into something that helps others. That's what my mother did. That's what I'm trying to do. And if you're listening to this, that's what you can do too. Thank you for hearing my story. Now go tell yours.